Hey, my name is Tom Hollingsworth, and I am the event lead for all things networking here at Tech Field Day. And we're excited because we're bringing you a special roundtable discussion. Once we get this many smart brains in the room, we kind of want to talk a little bit about the state of where things are. Um, Obviously, service providers are a very important part of what we do, but just like any other technology area, we kind of have to do a little bit of a forward look at where things are headed. So it's kind of important to think about where we are and some of the challenges that we're facing and how we're going to solve them. And thankfully, I have very smart people in the room to help me figure that out. So a little bit about us before we get going. The agenda for this is we're going to do a little quick delegate introduction, then we're going to talk about the state of where we are right now. And then I got a couple of topics that I want to throw out to our delegates around the cloud and also some of the protocols that we use. So in case anybody out there doesn't know who I am, I'm Tom Hollingsworth. I am CCIE number 29213, which if you're keeping track was 11 years ago. And I'm the event lead for networking, which means I spend a lot of my time talking about networking, but not a whole lot of my time doing it. But thankfully, I have wonderful people here who more networking than I do that can tell you a little bit about who they are. So I'd like to take a moment for them to introduce themselves, starting with Charles.
Hi everyone, my name is Charles Odizi. I'm an undergraduate studying information technology, and I'm the final year working on the research project for ISPs.
Hey there, I'm Chris Cummings, and I am a network automation engineer these days. I used to be a network engineer, so I'm recovering, I suppose. I'm on Twitter at CrankyNetMan.
So my name is Dave Penaloza. My Twitter handle is David Samuel PS, and I work as a consulting engineer for Verizon. So I do SD-WAN service providers and plenty of SDNs on a daily basis.
Sure thing. Jay Stewart, network engineer working alongside Chris at ESNet. Grew up in the service provider life, and I plan on staying there. Twitter handle is Dreaders2, because I guess I'm number 2.
I'm John Osman. I'm in Albuquerque, New Mexico. My Twitter handle is @John Osman. I work with a couple of service providers here in town, some of the data centers, and have recently started the Albuquerque IX. If you get around here, please come join us.
Awesome. Pete?
CCIE 1773, tweet at PJ Welcher. 25 years as a CCIE net architect. I'm on reduced hours. I'm still curious about technology, but now I get to read more of what I want as opposed to what the customer wants.
Hi, Steve Kaluka. I'm over 30 years in technology, recently retired from a regional service provider, DQE Communications in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and looking forward to the discussion here on Twitter with my name, S. Paluca, and Twitter and LinkedIn is where I hang out.
I'm Vince Shuley. You can find me on Twitter at Shuley22. I spent 10 years in Department of Defense doing networking there, and now a consulting network architect for service providers.
All right. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. This should be a really interesting discussion because I know that our Tech Field Day delegates are never shy about asking questions. Well, in order to figure out where we're going, in the words of Dr. Daniel Jackson, we need a point of origin. We need to know where we're at before we know where to get where we're going. So let's talk a little bit real quickly about kind of the state of service providers today, because I would argue that with the changes that have been going on over the last 4 or 5 years, service providers have a different task than they used to. Traffic is still very much north-south dominated. We're sending a lot of traffic out of our enterprises. The places that they're going, though, have shrunk significantly. We're no longer sending them to data centers all over the country or the world. We seem to be sending them to places like in Reston, Virginia, or Corvallis, Oregon, things like East 1, East 2, you name it. And there's a lot more of that because someone convinced people in the enterprise that you should just host it in the cloud and it'll be better if it's up there. And that's potentially true if you're a compute person, but if you're a networking person, you're like, oh boy, that's a lot of traffic. And so a lot of the traditional designs that we've always done for a number of years look very different when we're trying to solve for those problems. And of course, budgets haven't grown, right? Do more with less, do much more with much less. But now we have these ridiculously high expectations of how the network is going to perform. And if you don't believe me, you should be hanging around the next time someone complains that the network is down. Well, if that's an enterprise, it's not a big problem, right? Because that's just one network that's gone offline. But if you're a transit provider, or if you're providing network services for a number of local organizations, If your network goes down, about 50 other ones go down. So the challenges can be difficult. So that's where we're at right now. Increased traffic loads going to a select number of places. And of course, you need to do more with less. So I want to jump in and talk about our very first topic here, which is challenges related to the cloud. If you're just joining us from living under your rock for the last 5 years, Amazon is no longer the world's largest online bookstore. They are the world's largest online provider of all things related to compute, whether it's storage or processing power or data lakes or you name it. Amazon has a service for it. And not to be outdone, Microsoft has several of their own. So does Google. Insert joke about Larry Ellison and Oracle Cloud here. However, what does that look like from a service provider perspective? So this is kind of where I want to open it up to our delegates to kind of talk about this. Have you seen shifts in the way that people are doing their traffic loads based on the fact that over the last 5 years, more and more of them seem to be headed to US East 1 or whatever the default instance in Azure is, compared to before where there was a lot of local processing happening inside the enterprise before it ever got sent out the northbound interface?
So yeah, I think the first thing we noticed as a regional service provider with business customers is that the traffic growth was still happening and has been happening even before the cloud. But as you said, some of it's consolidating to particular locations, and it's going to be Office 365, AWS data centers, and things of this nature. And that first happened over the general internet via VPNs. And we very quickly noticed that there was a lot of demand for direct connect to AWS and to Azure, because pretty much all the corporations are dealing with both of those. They're dealing with Microsoft and AWS. So we pretty quickly had to get into the business of providing local transit to third-party providers that gave these direct connect connections and getting into the direct connect business ourselves as well as making sure, of course, that the transit over the internet actually worked and that we scaled up the outbound traffic as needed to cover the growth in traffic over time.
So I'm kind of curious, was that a slow build? Did you see that starting to kind of occur as Microsoft was more and more successful convincing people that Office 365 was the way in the light? Or was it like someone flipped a light switch one day, like, oh, hey, everybody got an Office 365 subscription for Christmas. So when you get back to the office, boom, now there's 33% more traffic headed out to these particular peering points or these particular application handoff areas.
Well, Microsoft licensing is this odd combination of cookies and arm twisting, where they tempt you with their wonderful treats, and then they kind of force you to buy more by creating their odd little bundles. But at the end of the day, most of the enterprises, have some kind of licensing with Microsoft, and because Microsoft is making those cloud services, the traffic's coming to you over the internet as a result.
Yeah, I would just kind of echo Steve's comment. I would also say that, over the top content providers like Google, they've already had their rise back in sort of like 2007, 2010 area. And now we're kind of seeing like cloud V2 connectivity, where it's not so much just connecting to AWS, it's more extending their AWS instance back into on-prem with the advent of ExpressRoute or Direct Connect and whatnot. And, a lot of that is, we're service providers, we're providing this sort of layer 2 facilitation between AWS and the cloud versus their on-prem environments. And it's just another VPLS circuit. So yeah, we're becoming effectively quite a dumb pipe in that regard. But we're also seeing the rise of SDN overlays within the cloud itself, like with Aviatrix, and cloud is just becoming dumb compute. So it's kind of a paradigm shift is occurring where everybody's shifting to the cloud. There's the cost center analysis that says maybe the cloud isn't worth it. So everybody starts shifting back. That shifting still occurs on the ISP's backbone, right? Comes down to who owns the physical footprint, who owns the fiber, who owns the routers that this traffic's moving towards.
So it's an interesting point, Jay. You talk about the fact that you're effectively just becoming a dumb pipe, that we're sending the traffic over to a location. But what were services were being provided, or what additional value was being added in that transit area before that would allow a customer to kind of realize that there's more to traffic than just making it go to the cloud? And quite honestly, the question that I have is, where would that be replicated? Is this something that's effectively lost forever because the cloud providers don't care? They've already got your traffic. Why do we need to optimize it?
I've kind of sat back and, for people talking about dumb clouds, I've always thought for the last 25 years that if you couldn't make make the business work as a dumb pipe, then you weren't doing things right, because the things that you were trying to do that were smart for people had very limited time lengths. So, they were going to make a lot of money. So I don't see a big change, particularly in the smaller providers, because they're simply having to find new paths for their customers to be able to get to where they want to be. And it's always been a shifting market of who that endpoint is going to be.
Yeah, and I think one thing that is shifting a bit is that, like Jay and Steve were mentioning, and especially Jay's point about how cloud is shifting even just over the evolution of cloud from a service provider standpoint. It used to be like you needed to get to the cloud providers themselves and like their content caches and stuff to deliver traffic to them, but it was still just regular internet traffic, and you just needed to augment your peerings and things like that. You're also seeing now that you need to provide, like layer 2 connectivity to extend the cloud provider's network, like Jay was mentioning, back to the customer, and being like a direct connect reseller and things like that. So that's a huge change for ISPs, because it's not just augmenting your transit anymore. It's also providing new services to connect to cloud providers and extending their networks through yours in a significantly different way than I think a lot of historical service provider connections have worked.
So I'm finding myself thinking, does this mean that service providers to some extent get subsumed by the cloud providers? That the reason you would go through your cloud provider to buy a connection, and it's brand X, you don't care which service provider? Is that a possibility?
I think that hits up against the physical realm of who owns which infrastructure where, and that still matters, right? Like who is running fiber into these metros? Comcast's backbone versus Lumen's backbone. That's still a question that's still, software has its reach and software does eat the world, but when it butts up against that physicality, that's where things, still have their own boundaries. So.
Yeah, that's definitely the space that the local service providers like us particularly play in, because we have the fiber to the buildings. So whether it's AWS or any of the big providers, they're coming in. They may have a national agreement with a big Fortune 500 company, but they don't have fiber in the rural areas that we do, that they need to reach to get to their factories and their offices. So at the end of the day, that's the one thing the small regionals still have is, at the end of the day, you physically have to connect that factory, that office, that whatever. And we're the only way you're going to get there. So at the end of the day, you're going to pay us through some means.
And like Jay was saying, I think, the physicality becomes a point, and then it's a layer 2 VPN. It's just another layer 2 VPN. Where I see the real change happening is we're going away from older styles of L2 VPN with LDP signaled VPLS, and everything is starting to move towards eVPN and things that are more extensible in how we deliver that service back to wherever that layer 2 endpoint is, just to simplify the overall delivery.
Although, isn't the ultimate simplification when you actually just do ZTNA, where you're going directly from user to application without a VPN, just authentication and encrypted traffic? Wow, that threw a clunker.
Well, actually, let me piggyback on that a little bit, Pete, because I think it's interesting that we're still thinking in terms of users. Like we very much think that Bob in accounting has the ability to get out, or that this traffic flow is such and such. But in realistic terms, that's not the case anymore. So if we want to like scale everything back to the OSI model, there's layers of things, right? And the enterprise is very much concerned with frames for the most part. We're getting these packets around the network, or sorry, this data around the network as fast as possible, mostly at layer 2, depending on the size of your organization. Service providers are very focused on layer 3, right? We need to route this traffic. We need to make it go places. But I'll tell you that the cloud is very much focused on layer 7, which is the application, because to them, there is no other atomic unit. We don't care about a frame or a packet. What we care about is whether or not this thing that I launched on my computer or my tablet or my phone can communicate. And that makes it very difficult to troubleshoot, because when we're breaking these things down into smaller atomic units, as a conversation we had earlier today, like you need to know why things do the way that they do. You need to know what an ARP request looks like. You need to know what gratuitous ARP is. You need to know what an asymmetrical routing problem looks like. But today, that's all handled in a smoke screen behind a little icon that looks like a pencil or something that you walk in every day and you click the button and it works. So how can service providers kind of work around the expectations that people have when it comes to application networking? Because the cloud is just going to shrug their shoulders and go, you wrote the stupid thing and we configured it the way you told us to write it. If it's not working, it ain't our fault.
I don't think it's going to change too much, honestly, because the fact that now then it's boiling down to who's going to provide the dump pipe to simply send your traffic upstream towards the cloud, then it tells you that everything is going to be handled by an upper layer and adding another level of interaction. So it's going to be all encapsulated one inside another thing, and you will have this massive overhead just to get, I don't know, SAP or whatever the application uplink from the office towards cloud. So again, that's where the observability is going to play a role, because then you have to understand how many times this packet has been redirected by some fancy overlay until it gets to the cloud, and to try to accommodate that into the needs of the customers that you're providing a service to. Which anyway is just, well, how nice is or nicer is my pipe compared to the other one, and it's going to do exactly the same, but mine is, I don't know, pink.
How do you explain to the end user that encapsulation you're talking about and shipping things across the net, across maybe the entire continent for no reason except that happened to be the provider you used, and then pushing all these things back together, and we're adding this this latency on there for something like maybe it's a DNS request that we should have probably taken care of with a local resolver rather than relying on something up in the cloud. How do you deal with all of those issues as a service provider when you're trying to explain to people that everything that we promised you is working? It happens to be that the way that you're trying to grab that service is very poorly engineered.
Seems like now is just that the means, the objective justify the means, is it? So now it's going to be, it works. We don't know how it does, but it does in some way. It doesn't matter if it goes to Japan and then comes back because your application is anyway working. Just don't ask me. It's all abstracted.
How much collective time have all of us lost due to this prevalence of people pushing their DNS resolution out to somebody else rather than having it locally? It works great. Everybody loves it. It's easy to troubleshoot, but we've lost a lot. What other things are we going to lose?
I've seen the other where we had a customer who was standing up a new web page, and it turned out that the reason the web page was ungodly slow was all the authentication was, let's just say, a long way away in terms of light speed.
But Pete, that's actually a really good point, because who created that problem? I know who created that problem, and this is my little molehill that I'm going to die on. The network is a client of the users. We know that. It effectively functions like a utility. But it also means you can't blame the network when you do dumb things like, I don't know, copy and paste something off of Stack Overflow and suddenly you're overloading an authentication server. Or what's multipath? I don't know how that works. I mean, my favorite example of this is vMotion. vMotion exists because application developers were too lazy to make their application figure out when they lost connectivity. And every time I encounter people who are talking about, importing legacy applications and platforms into the cloud, the lift and shift model, I'm like, ask Netflix what they use for vMotion. And there's usually a lot of furtive glances, and I'm like, they don't. because they wrote an application that can survive a loss of connectivity, that knows to go out and look for things when they're solved to solve, instead of just going, if you could just keep the IP the same and move this workload from LA to New York in less than 180 milliseconds, I'd love that. Is there a way that we can kind of do our best to prevent these things from happening and throw our hands up and push it back over the fence to the developers going, write better code?
Does this imply that if everything moves to IPv6, then you wouldn't be that much worried?
Why did you have to go there? Because I think Cummings is about to come through the Zoom call at you. But I mean, but let's talk about that. Does that change things? Does changing the protocol that we're running under actually solve any of those problems? Because quite honestly, if you look at a developer and tell them something, they're not going to care. And if you're a developer that's hard coding IPv4 addresses into your app, we need to talk.
So putting on my hat as a software developer now, I think that it makes a difference depending on the background of software developers. And I think that software developers in general need to have a better understanding of the network knowledge domain because it's usually sorely lacking. So coming from a network operator into software has been an interesting transition. But to like the specific question around IPv6, I do think that it does make a huge difference over IPv4 because once you have end-to-end addressing regained, it gives you so many more options in terms of high availability and reachability and things like that that you didn't have before when you have everything hidden behind 27 layers of NAT and then some CG NAT and then some Docker stuff and then Kubernetes doing its thing. And like, I think that that's where really us network operators, well, you network operators, I suppose now, need to really get more invested in the software realm and stay like more involved in like the development of things like Kubernetes and Docker and really be working on better like network stacks and things like that in there because it's usually done in really dumb ways because people just don't know how networks work. And so like talking to your friendly local developer and making sure that you can train them up on network concepts when they ask. I found that most developers are actually really interested in this stuff and want to know how that magical black box network works. But a lot of times, a lot of us network people are a little cranky netmen, and that doesn't help, right?
We had a customer who was running Kubernetes, and they wanted, for reasons that we won't go into, they wanted to spin up something like 50,000 service instances, small servers basically, but they wanted to get them to all get addresses from their IPAM, which didn't like that. Answer was for them to get them from Amazon's IPAM instead of on-site, on-prem info blocks, but yeah, it's kind of like, why do you need an address for every service?
Well, bringing it back to Tom's point, I think it's elitist if we as an industry just say it's not the network and wipe our hands clean. I think from, like Chris said, there needs to be building from both sides, and we can't just chuck grenades of assumptions or even concrete proof that, hey, the network is good enough and I don't care. Like, we need to become more familiarized with how it works on the application stack, even if the developers don't care to, right? Maybe that's just the culture of where you at, and I'm sorry, maybe you work in a sucky place, but we got to be built better about traveling outside the domains of our expertise and bridging.
Let me lob in another thought then, because I'm starting to see, I've been checking out a couple of startups, and in the edge domain, people seem to be talking about, we privately talked about data lakes. They're talking about automatically replicating your applications and data between some central location perhaps and edges, and how you synchronize a whole bunch of edge instances is a real can of worms problem. So I think that's going to be a hot thing a year or two out, but people may buy into it. It's sort of like the VMware story of only scaled up as far as potential problems. So are people going to see that as a panacea?
So Jay, I think you do actually bring up an interesting point that I want to just take a moment to riff on. I totally agree that it's not the networking team's job to immediately absolve themselves of blame and stop there. But there's an understood piece there, is I will help you if you will accept my help. And I think that that's a big problem, is, and I can say this because I've worked on a help desk before. And I used to get inbound calls from other help desks that had a shorter call time than me. And it was, as soon as I can prove this isn't my problem, then I can dump this call off on the poor gateway tech, me. And so I would run them through the tests, and this is dial-up modem days. And I would say, okay, if it says this, then this is what happens. And if it says this other thing, then you need to call back and you need to tell the other tech these exact words so that they will fix their problem. And so I think that one of the issues that we run into, and to Chris's point, why a lot of us are cranky, is because we are continually blamed, because it's easy to blame us. We spend all of our time defending that it's not us, but when we're ready to go back and go, okay, the problem is not the network. The problem is your bad DNS configuration. The problem is this. The problem is that, as near as I can tell. Then it's, well, I don't want you to help me fix it. Or, I appreciate you looking at that. We'll take care of it. Or something along those lines. It's basically a curt dismissal. If we're going to put in the effort to help, you need to put in the effort to accept the help of the network team, or you need to stop blaming us.
Additionally, I think that, like, I forget the name of the principle, but the more or less states that the thing that's going to get blamed the most is the thing that's understood the least, which is typically the network, right? And maybe that's because it's complex, which it is. But I think we could do a lot in the way of observability and monitoring, and providing that as endpoints to our customers as network operators, right? To our customers, which are our software developers, right? And being able to provide them with better visibility into things working or not. And I feel like that was kind of the theme of Field Day today with Kintic presenting. But, I think opening up things a lot could really reduce a lot of it's the network kind of thing, because I guess maybe I just have more empathy now on the other side of the fence. I don't think that most software developers are really just dumb and just throwing it at the network but I've also been on the other side where it just gets thrown at me all the time. So I think there's things that both of us can do to really help improve.
So hold that thought about transparency and protocols, because we may come back to that in just a minute.
I think maybe I'm just touching something I should not, but I think it also has to do with the way that all the products are sold and shown. In most cases, it's the big word, the network is going to do everything for you. Just go and click and then it will pop up. And so you always have this magical product that is going to do everything for you. And then it's simply obfuscated or abstracted and nobody ever knows what the hell happens. And as a developer, then why would you have to know anyways? Just put whatever, the information you want there, because anyway, the network is going to make it work. So I think it's also the way we approach the selling some products, or the way we try to make them then commercial. Because if you don't sell it as a commodity, as something solving a particular solution, then it's not going to be interesting for anybody.
How do you deal
maybe
with
maybe I'm just going too far into it, but my bad.
Yeah, I just want to say this too, is that as a regional service provider, we're the opposite in a lot of ways. What you're talking about here is because we actually sell the fact that our NOC will take those calls, will help you fix the problem, whether it's us or you. And we've got a lot of customers off of the big guys because their mission in life is to be the cranky net man who says, it ain't my fault, hang up, close the ticket. Where we'll work with them to figure out, hey, when you migrated the front end to AWS and you left the back end on site, that's really what created this problem here, and not the direct connect between AWS and your site. And we help you identify that,
I have a kind of a opposite approach here, I think, or maybe inverting the way we look at this problem. When everything becomes that application centric, now is it the responsibility of the enterprise selling the product to become more connected to make sure that their product is available, right? Because go back to the ZTNA, right? I'm just logging into a VPN service from my computer at that point. It's authenticating me through a bunch of stuff. Really, you're just relying on your upstream to make sure you're connected one hop, and then that application being connected, that could be 2 or 3 rows down the path, and they need to have more than one setup there to handle that.
All right. One last thing that I actually want to talk about here before we move on to our next topic. We actually recorded an on-premise IT podcast about service providers, and specifically this idea that over the last few years that enterprises have kind of taken on the service provider mentality. Facebook has really led the way with this. Sorry, Meta has really led the way with this, where your enterprise needs to perform like a service provider and treat your users like customers. But I also wonder, is there a little bit of pushback in that some of the things inside of a service provider need to kind of act like an enterprise? I don't know if it's like a low latency thing or visibility into what's going on. I can say for a fact that there were a lot of people that would have liked a lot of visibility into Rogers Communications a few weeks ago. But is this something that would alleviate some of these questions or some of the stress that network admins are feeling, where it's like the packets go out and I don't know what happens to them after that?
Well, I've encountered a case of that with a local access provider, one of the big ones, where the reporting was about 20 years behind the times. They were reporting hourly stats on network traffic levels. And it's like, I'd like to know latency. I'd like, let's say, 30-second stats. Come on, give the customer something more where they can see the bursts of traffic, which is why they're having the problem.
Well, it's also questionable if, to which providers actually have this level of visibility, because believe it or not, many of them don't have it, or maybe they just have a limited amount of it. They don't have all the details they would like to have, and in most cases, maybe their infrastructure is not ready for that, because many of them just outgrew themselves in a I don't know if organically, but then they have this appendix of the networking one side. They have this other legacy thing that nobody ever touches, because if it works, then just don't break it. And suddenly, okay, so how do we then check things that might support SNMP? Some others might, for some reason, they might support some other type of polling, and then you have some other devices that are rather new to do telemetry, but we cannot put everything together in a single product. Then you would have to then match many things together. It's very complicated, because the network then also tends to be heterogeneous. It's just a little of everything, simply because we cannot have only one vendor, so not everything is supported. Some devices are very old, some others are very new. It's complicated to have visibility over something that you don't even know how, well, you don't even know the dimensions of. Because in many cases they say, oh, I don't know what's behind this router because none of us knows. And the guys who knew, well, maybe he left or he died.
Everybody wants that visibility and insight until they see the amount of that it costs to get that.
Right? Exactly.
So it's like, yeah, I want everything, and then it comes to I need a team of developers, led by Chris, that is going to maintain all of that. And oh yeah, that wasn't in the budget. So the first thing to go is insights, because it's just an extra.
I've even worked at providers events where when we turned on monitoring, the provider, the owner of the company was like, hey, can we turn that off? We're getting like way too many alerts. And it was because everything was broken all the time, right? And it was just like, that was the other kind of side of that coin, was that, oh yeah, sometimes you don't know things are broken and your customers don't complain loud enough, and you don't see that. And some people are perfectly happy in that bliss. And once you know about it, you have to fix it.
Well, visibility is nice as long as all the bars are green, right?
Well, and the visibility is very difficult. If you're a true ISP and you don't control the firewall and you don't know anything about the NAT that's going on, and you have hundreds of customers, your monitoring on the internet side only is very limited. Because you're aggregating together literally all of the traffic from each of those customers on an enterprise side behind generally a single IP address. And it's not going to untangle, and it's not going to be very helpful, because I don't control their firewall. I don't know the NAT on the other side. I don't know what this stuff is coming from. So yeah, I have that monitoring and it's in place, but it only gives me a very limited piece of information to help them in moving forward on the troubleshooting of the internet problem.
And Steve, how many times did you find that the people that were in charge of that should know about that didn't understand it either? And even when you tried to help them, you couldn't help their end user.
Yeah, because they're not, we deal with a lot of very small companies which don't even have a dedicated IT person. And so, it's like, what's a firewall? It's like, well, it's that thing you hired a guy for 3 hours to set up once for you 2 years ago.
I'm in that statement. I was the guy for many years.
Ah,
Right.
so it's all your fault, though.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I'll
Don't
go
blame
with
the
that.
network team, Tom. Yeah, this is my
I
new
got some
supermodel
tickets to
play, Tom.
transfer to you, Tom.
Go for it. They'll go into the black hole, same place that BGP writes all my traffic. All right, we're going to go ahead and move on to our next topic because I want to make sure that we have ample time to argue about it, as is the right of all tech field day delegates. So really, networking is just a bunch of protocols, right? Whether it's TCP or IP or UDP or BGP or DNS. Well, DNS maybe not so much for networking, but like one of the things we just can't escape is this idea of protocol issues. And one of the things that I think that we've really started seeing a lot over the last, I'd say maybe a couple of years, is the fact that a lot of the things that we have built in the past are based on some pretty shaky foundations. As is often the case, I'm sure you've probably seen the memes, the haiku. It can't be DNS. I checked everything. It was DNS. That's not a haiku, but and the corollary of that rule, of course, is except when it's BGP. But we've also seen like some crazy little attacks that have been going on where, nefarious actors will reroute BGP from like apple.com for about an hour through their data center for absolutely no reason whatsoever. And BGP just assumes that people would never want to do anything silly. I guess they needed a fourth napkin to write all the security stuff on it. But that kind of comes part and parcel with what we do here. We can't just invent new protocols out of whole cloth. I mean, that's why the IEEE and the IETF exist. But one of the things that we have to think about is, okay, well, with the pace of acceleration of change that we're dealing with today, how do we fix these problems? How do we look at BGP and pat it on the head and say, good girl? Like, what do we do to fix that?
Well, I guess you're referring to the Manners project.
So we can actually talk about that. So Manners, for those of you who are not familiar, is mutually assured norms for routing security. It's a community effort that's been put together to effectively say something's got to be done. So is Manners a good step, or do we need to go somewhere higher and kind of dictate from on high that it's time to have BGP v5 with security?
Well, I would say, they're as you indicate, they're two different things. But I think Manners is the obvious next step. It's been widely implemented with all the tier ones, a good part of the tier twos. It's getting some traction. I've been in pushing for it for a while in a regional ISPN was pleased that the CEO of the company, who's not involved in networking at all, actually asked about it this past year. It's getting on the radar of executives even. So I think it's a reasonable next step in the evolution of BGP. So I would say that to the first part of this. To the second part, I just think the internet now is too big, too diverse, and too many small nodes to reasonably rip and replace a whole new version of BGP would be my thought on that. I would hope it wasn't the case, because that's probably ultimately the right thing to do, but it's just too big a monster with too much old gear out there to be practical.
I'd have to agree very heavily there. I think that there's a lot of people that like to say that the sky is falling about BGP and write lots and lots of angry blog posts about it and whatever, right? And I think I don't think that's helpful. I really don't see that as useful, and I think that with all big overarching systemic fixes that need to happen, it has to happen in small chunks, right? Just like eating an elephant, you do it one bite at a time. And I think that Manners is such a great starting point. Implementing RPKI and ROAs and all that fun stuff, like that is all really the crux of it. And I view most of those things not being done yet as a education issue for a lot of operators, right? And like a knowledge gap issue. And I don't even know that so much of it's a protocol issue. Like, yes, if we were to start over with BGP, we could put in way more, guardrails to prevent some of the dumb stuff that happens daily from happening. but we didn't, and we're here. And so, like, I think we have to take small incremental steps, and that really begins by educating people. Because I think if we just were to throw away BGP, do a BGP v5, and we would be stuck dual stacking BGP v4 and BGP v5 until the end of time, and we'd always have, well, I still have to keep BGP v4. What is it with v4 protocols that just won't go away? We'd be keeping with BGP v4, until the heat death of the universe, and we'd still have all the same problems, right? Where with incremental wins, like you can, and with manners, we have, greatly reduce the blast radius of the leaks that will and do continue to happen with BGP. And so I think like an air of positivity around it really helps, because I think a lot of people hear some of that negative commentary around BGP and give up and just say it's broken and there's nothing we can do, like, oh, too bad. And I'm a huge believer in incremental progress to achieving goals.
I like
So-
all that I just heard. The flip side that I'm thinking is I've been reading about people wanting to overload BGP with all sorts of other information, for lack of a better term. So you get this iterative problem of, oh, you're going to put more in, you better secure that chunk too.
Yeah, EVPN is a great example of loading BGP with tons of stuff, but a BGPLS,
And then you get islands that aren't consistent in terms of what they support. So we've met the enemy, and he is us.
So I think Manners is an awesome step, an awesome organization, but in my mind, it's like the law of the commons is really what we're victimized by, right? Like the people looking at Manners are probably the ones that are like, well, let me check my checklist here. Am I doing the right things on my network? And they're already starting to think about how to be a good netizen, right? BCP38 filtration, route filtration, that type of thing. It's really the networks where, maybe it is a small network, small ISP, and the owner is not, doesn't want to invest a lot of time into engineering. So you have, network engineers that, put out a prefix list that announces all the internet routes, to their upstream. Their upstream, cheap as they come, doesn't do any filtration ever. And, it affects large swaths of the internet. So I feel like Manners is the right step, but we need to limit the blast radius of these events, right? RPKI. It's a proper protocol. It can help us there.
I'll go back to Chris's point about education, right? A lot of times it just comes down to people don't know, or they don't know how to do filtering, right? It's, hey, yeah, I started this ISP. I don't even know what a prefix list is. So where do I start? And then it's kind of our responsibility to go back and say, yeah, you want to filter what you accept. You want to run RPKI. You want to, sign your routes. You want to do all these things and help them through that process, instead of just bashing them over the head that you're doing it wrong and you're unsecure, and you have to do everything different.
So you're going to write a best practices document?
Well,
that's essentially what Manners is a way to implement RPKI with a full training program and a best practices push to make RPKI happen across the internet. I mean, that is the Manners project.
Well, although I agree with Steve and with Vince and also with Chris, it's also about not people not knowing, as in not having the right training, but it's also about some people who are just willfully ignorant. They just want to keep things the way they are because it's not the first thing in their priority list. This is not going to bring me more money, so I'll just put it lower and lower. And as anything that happens in the internet is about a lot of people collaborating, and that not everyone wants to collaborate, not everyone wants to join the pack, not everyone wants to make it better for some others because it's about you making money, right? So I think it has some roots in the cultural background that many people would have, and how it's convenient for some others just leave it that way because somebody else is going to fix it for me.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times the only way that some of this stuff kind of gets implemented is by larger players kind of, forcing the hand of smaller players in things.
Social pressure.
Yeah, social pressure. And I guess from a technical standpoint, it does make me sad that, actually depreffing RPKI routes is actually kind of coming out as a bad thing. Because that was one of my hopes, is like a good way that you could kind of use that pressure hammer to be like, well, yeah, you're going to take dumb paths if you don't turn on RPKI, and all of a sudden it's the money motivator, which I think a lot of this comes down to is like there need to be financial motivators for any organization to do this stuff. Because like if I'm Joe's coffee shop who needs BGP multi-homed AS for my data center that I self-host my coffee ordering app, right? Like I don't care. Yeah, that's a really detailed. Like I don't care about RBKI. I care about selling coffee and making money, and for better or for worse, that's the society we live in. Like how do you add a financial incentive? This is just like because it's not me if I'm not going to talk about IPv6. Like it's the same thing with IPv6 deployments. Like a lot of people don't do it just because it doesn't make sense for them financially, or they don't know that it would make sense for them financially. Like I wonder, are there, maybe the group here knows, like what are the financial benefits of doing manners? As someone who fully supports it, like what are the financial benefits to me if I'm just
Chris, I won't go
Many
with
of them just go through the path of least resistance, though.
right? Exactly.
Ah, my bad. Go ahead, Vince.
I was gonna say, another motivator which you can kind of see starting to take off with the IPv6 space is government regulation, right? So if you want to deal with government services, then you have to have RPKI enabled, or the same way as with the IPv6 OMB memo that says if you want to deal with government, then you have to have IPv6, and then you can start to go and kind of force the hammer, because otherwise you can't get customers, which brings it back around to money, but through a different way of hitting it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. The hammer from on high. I like the OMB IPv6 memo. I think is a great example of that. I'm glad you brought that up because like I really do see that as something that's going to impart a lot of change on the V6 deployment model, because government agencies are wanting to turn off IPv4, and like this time we mean it. Like I really do think that once that happens, and all of a sudden Joe's coffee shop, to use that example, can't pay their taxes to the IRS because V4 is disabled, all of a sudden they're going to call up their provider and be like, wow, why do I not have this new internet thing, and why have you not done it? And so like as providers, we really are better off to do these things in advance of it becoming a problem. Well, hopefully people will do that.
Well, you talked about the fact that large companies can drive these kinds of decisions, like basically force a sea change, if you will. And we have large companies that can. Amazon, Microsoft, Google, IBM, Oracle. All they have to do is say, transit providers, if you're peering with us, you're using RPKI, you're using manners, we will not accept routes that do that. And then honestly, it actually gives the transit providers and the local providers an out. Hey, they told us we have to do it. You have to do it too. We are simply passing along the thing. And I would say within months of that kind of coming down the pike, you would be able to rapidly change the situation. And I think that once you have changed that situation, it will continue to have forward-looking benefits. For example, on a weekly, if not monthly basis, we see AS hijackings. We see bad configurations that route the entirety of YouTube through Pakistan. Okay, that's bad. We know that. But if we could do something simple to make that happen, and someone is telling us that they're forcing that to happen, isn't that a better solution overall than just shrugging our shoulders and going, well, BGP is old and we don't think we can fix it?
Yeah, and I feel like currently we're in kind of a good, the bad, the ugly, like, standoff where, what provider is going to do that first? Because the second that I say, sorry, we're not accepting your routes anymore because you're not doing this, they're like, okay, cool, I'll go to AWS. Now, maybe they're so locked in and that's not a thing, but I feel like a lot of like transit providers, right, that could also wield that hammer might be a little bit reluctant to do it. Now, some have done it, but some might be a little reluctant to do it because if you are the first one to go, then somebody might just leave for your competitor who's not doing it because it might be cheaper to do that than to actually spend the time.
I would argue, Tom, that to Chris's point, some of the bigger transit providers actually already did that. Like Lumen last year enabled RPKI. I don't agree with how they went about rolling it out because the socialization wasn't great, but they said, if your routes aren't signed, we're going to drop them. And then it forced everybody to go and sign all the routes that was peering with Lumen. But to say it from the enterprise perspective, provider has to force the enterprise to sign their routes, because it's far more the aspect of, you know, the coffee shop doesn't know that, you know, they barely were able to get their BGP ASN registered, you know, asking them to go in and sign their routes. That's a whole nother step. So you have to go and help them do that, or, you know, get their details, show them how to do it. So I think it's kind of almost reversed of not the big enterprise responsibility, but the big transit provider's responsibility.
Yeah, that's exactly why it's not happening at a lot of the regionals, I'm sure. At least it's why, you know, we're still not fully implemented here, is because, yeah, as soon as you turn on, you know, those, you know, using the route databases and RPKI, that means every BGP customer to you has to play nice in this, not just me, but all of those dozens and dozens of downstream customers. And that means I got to go there, and our engineers have to hold their hand, help them set this up, help them register their prefixes in the database, and to set up the RPKI. So it's not money, it's time, engineering time. That's the reason this hasn't been done at the tier 2 and below level. I mean, the big boys are dealing with the Fortune 500. I mean, those it's no big deal. You throw it over the fence and you say, do this, and those guys will figure it out. But like you said, the guy who's done BGP for the first and only time at a regional provider 5 years ago, somebody's going to have to hold his hand and teach him all this.
So can I ask then, how effective do we think Cloudflare's campaign to get RPKI adoption skyrocketed? How effective do you think that was? 'Cause I think it was effective. I don't like naming and shaming, but that worked.
Yeah, I think I love that naming and shaming.
It definitely worked with the tier 1s. I mean, they came on board right away, and it's easier for them because, number one, they have a much larger engineering team, and number two, the vast majority of their BGP customers, they can throw it over the wall and they will figure it out because they have an engineering team. But now that you're down at the regional level, it's a different story.
So I think, what was the mechanism that they got people to kind of name and shame, right? They would have some sort of tool where it would proxy against or look up your public IP address, as long as it's not CG natted. Well, even if it was CG natted, they would just have you a boilerplate template that says my ISP does not run RPKI, right? I mean, beautiful.
Yeah, it was really cool. Just advertise a bad prefix on purpose, and then see if you can get to it from this web page, and just shame people. I'm a huge fan of that, and sadly, I don't think it was well received against the networking community. I know there was a lot of engineers that really did not like it, and like I know certain mailing lists might have exploded a little bit with anger when that happened, and I feel like that's too bad that we just have to have this like attack response to it.
I'm sure there are still ISPs that are mad you can't peer with each other using SPX or token ring, but the fact of the matter is that somebody has to move the needle. And if Cloudflare is the one who's willing to soak that anger, then, you know, as Jay brought up, I think that that's a perfectly valid thing, because if it did move the needle, if it did increase adoption of something that we would consider at this point almost to be a foundational security tenant, then so be it. Like that's the thing. It's, you know, you guys brought it up. You know, nobody wants to be the first person to make the rule that you must change all your BGP peerings. Well, somebody has to be first, and I would argue that whoever is first, yeah, they're probably going to get some bad press for a while, or yeah, there is a possibility that someone's going to leave, but eventually someone is going to be last, and then nobody's going to have a choice anymore. And so you can't just keep hopping to different providers hoping that they won't make you, you know, turn up RPKI. And if you don't have it and don't know how to install it or don't know how to configure it, guess what? You're ready to learn. Like we don't. This isn't the CCIE route switch exam where you learn just enough BGP to pass and then forget all of it. Like you need to keep up with things, and that kind of leads into the next thing that kind of goes on to this, because we've kind of talked about the fact maybe we can't wreck everything and rebuild it from scratch. Well, can we abstract it away and basically, you know, in a way say click here to enable RPKI and basically have the ability for maybe someone to come in and remotely do it, or have some kind of a configuration wizard, for lack of a better term, that will walk you through the process so that you don't have to think about it. Because I mean, if I was still having to compile programs from source on my computer, I don't think I'd have nearly as much software as I do now.
Tom, there's along that, Aaron has an excellent step-by-step instruction for here is how you sign your routes. And it's right there on their webpage. You can go through. A lot of people just don't even know how to get there. So hopefully people will go there, see it, read it, know their login, and it's type in these commands and your routes will at least be signed. Where I think we're kind of conflating a couple things here is there's signing your routes and then there's filtering by RP, and then there's filtering. Signing your routes is an awesome first step, and I think that anybody should be able to go out and do that today. And then it's the putting in the engineering effort to change all of your policy to actually pull down all of the information and filter routes, bi-directionally of, okay, my routes are valid, my customer routes are valid, I'm accepting valids, dropping invalids, and maybe I'm accepting unknowns, maybe I'm dropping unknowns, right? That's kind of up to you.
Well, yeah, that's a recent addition from Aaron, and that was one of the big bottlenecks before. Is you did have to deploy your own VPN and do your own route signing until at the end of last year when they offered that option directly themselves. I'm not sure if the other rears are also doing that, where they'll sign the routes for you publicly so that you can get them signed. But you're right, that having that available now from Aaron as a new online service is a big step that makes it practical for the regional ISPs to get these small customers to sign them and not have to take it on ourselves to sign it in our own server.
Another thing too that I have appreciated for kind of making BGP peering a bit easier, like Tom mentioned, like a point-and-click GUI. Well, I find that interesting because Jay did mention like some of it's a bit of a tragedy of the commons is like now anybody can spin up BGP and like the barrier is much lower. Like that makes it so anyone can do it and anybody can screw it up at a global scale. Now on certain mailing lists that will remain unnamed, they often be like, oh, you have to have a license to fly an aircraft. You should have to have a license to run BGP. I think that's dumb. But like on the topic of making it easier for you, like there's a RFC, it might still be a draft that is around creating standard BGP profiles that kind of classify peers into certain groups that then apply default standards around filtering. So like you as a provider could just profile somebody as a transit customer that, doesn't have any downstream ASNs, and then you just filter them appropriately with regex matching and stuff like that. Like there's a lot of really cool just safeguards, and I think MikroTik put that in their recent release of 7. So, like there are vendors starting to hop onto it, so maybe that as well will help kind of make this a bit easier, because filtering is hard. I mean, in the demo I did earlier today, like you saw like the like I kind of glossed over it, but like that whole like delivering a prefix service to do BCP38 filtering, that calls out to an external service running API, like a fast API written endpoint that's running on a Celery task scheduler that spawns off like parallel tasks to go talk out of peering DB, to talk to IRR, the IRR deals. It runs BGPQ3 and 4. Like it does all this stuff in the background. And like there are 20 people that work on developing like all of our tools together. And like it's not easy to do. So yeah, the easier we can make it, the better.
Yeah, that doesn't even get into all the community stuff you have to do for matching communities and doing this, that, and the other thing as part of your policies as well.
I think that'll actually wrap it up here, because you can see that networking is complicated no matter whether you're running a regular network in an enterprise or a service provider. Although I'd argue that a service provider is probably a little bit more complicated, for no other reason than you really can't take it down. But I think that ultimately what you need to do is you need to recognize the unique challenges that exist, and you need to find ways to fix them. And we talk a lot at Tech Field Day about new innovative solutions to these problems and ways to get visibility into things that we haven't been able to see before. And I think that ultimately, once we know what we're trying to accomplish, once we have a goal in place and we have visibility into the roadblocks, we have to make sure that we're working together with our teams to execute on fixing those problems. Simply because if we don't, we're going to be disorganized, we're going to create chaos, and we may not make the problem worse, but we definitely won't make it any better. So I think that the key there is to continually learn and grow and be ready to solve tomorrow's problems when they come up, as opposed to waiting for them to be dropped in our laps and have to transition off of some V4 protocol that doesn't seem to ever want to go away.